If you ever thought lighthouses were peaceful, think again. On the mist-choked afternoon of August 3, 2014, 44-year-old Elias Granger was the only soul stationed at the Devil's Crown Lighthouse, a notorious structure perched on the jagged cliffs of Black Hollow Bay, Oregon. His colleague had fallen ill that morning, and despite it being high summer, an unnatural fog had rolled in like a heavy curtain, smothering the coast. Visibility? Less than 50 feet in any direction. But what chilled Elias more than the lack of sight was the silence. No crashing waves, no seagulls, not even the whisper of a breeze. After making his routine rounds through the watchtower and oil room, Elias descended the rusted spiral staircase toward the keeper's quarters. That's when something caught his eye through the porthole window. The fog wasn't drifting, it was pulsing, slow, steady, like a breath, expanding, contracting, almost as if the fog itself were alive. But then it began to change, growing quicker, more erratic. And then, its color started shifting. What began as ghostly gray twisted into shades of deep crimson and dull green, moving like tendrils. Elias stood frozen, his breath caught halfway in his throat. That's when the lighthouse started humming. Elias Granger had manned the Devil's Crown Lighthouse for over a decade. He was known for his meticulous nature, always logging each detail of the weather, tide, and any oddities in a thick leather-bound journal. It was now nearing 4:30 in the afternoon, and Elias was still alone. That strange, dead fog hadn't lifted, it had thickened. A silence so absolute it felt like sound had been stolen from the world. As he made his way down the iron staircase after inspecting the lighting systems, his eyes kept drifting to the fog beyond the lighthouse window. It wasn't acting like fog anymore. It pulsed, gently at first, like slow breathing, then faster, more urgent, as if it was responding to something. The colors began to shift, first a strange cobalt blue, then into a shade Elias couldn't name, a hue that seemed alien, like it didn't belong in our reality. He stared, transfixed. The mist began to form tendrils, long, smooth strands that moved with precision, like fingers searching in the dark. These ropes of fog weaved together until they formed a glowing sphere, nearly 5 feet across, hovering just outside the window. It wasn't solid, yet within it danced hundreds of specks, like stars locked in strange orbits, moving in patterns that didn't make sense. And then, the impossible happened. The sphere passed directly through the glass. No shatter, no sound, no resistance. It simply phased through as if the wall were made of mist. Elias staggered back, heart pounding, eyes wide with disbelief. Once inside, the sphere began to change. It stretched, branched out, becoming something like a tree. A central trunk split into twisting limbs, and at the tip of each branch was a glowing orb. Within each orb, Elias could see moving images, otherworldly landscapes, twisted skies, oceans of fire, mountains floating upside down. The tree shape spun rapidly, its branches blurring until it suddenly stopped and reformed. Now, it resembled a figure, a humanoid shape with limbs, a torso, and a head-like structure. The head bloomed open like a mechanical flower, revealing what looked like an infinite tunnel of mirrors, each one reflecting into the next in endless recursion. Staring into it made Elias feel like he was both falling and being pulled backward at once. Then came the sound, but it wasn't sound, not like anything ears could register. Elias later described it as hearing colors. The resonance slipped straight into his mind, vibrating his very thoughts. Around him, objects, his old coffee mug, his radio, even the steel keys on the hook, all began to hum and shake in perfect unison with the pulse. Then the entity reached out, an arm, if it could be called that, extended toward Elias. At the tip, a small, perfectly round sphere emerged, blazing with a white light that felt impossibly heavy, like it carried entire galaxies inside, and somehow, Elias knew, it was offering it to him.
Driven by a mixture of awe and some deep instinct I couldn't explain, I reached out and touched the light. The moment my fingers brushed the sphere, everything changed. In one instant, I lived 1,000 lifetimes. I saw entire civilizations rise and fall, experienced joys and sorrows that weren't my own, and gained flashes of understanding that no human mind should ever hold. And then, just like that, it was over. I was on the cold metal floor. The entity was gone. The fog had thinned. Sunlight pierced through, weak but warm. I checked my watch.
So, this is where it all began with the lighthouse and, well, that strange encounter. 3 hours had passed, yet the entire encounter had felt like seconds, or centuries. And on his right index finger, where he'd touched the sphere, was a small circular burn mark. It never faded, never changed. In the weeks that followed, Elias started noticing strange things. Sometimes he'd know someone was about to knock before they did, or finish people's sentences before they even opened their mouths. But he never spoke of what really happened in the lighthouse, except once, years later, to someone who would write it all down and swear it was true. After the lighthouse incident, Elias Granger began to change. He'd dream in languages he'd never learned but somehow understood. Languages that felt older than the earth itself. Electronics malfunctioned when he got too emotional. Light bulbs would flicker, radios would squeal, and watches stopped cold in his presence. He told no one. Who would believe him? Months later, driven by sleepless nights and unshakable visions, Elias finally confided in a reclusive theoretical physicist named Dr. Mara Voss, a quantum anomalies researcher from Portland. After hours of careful, fascinated listening, Dr. Voss gave him an unsettling interpretation. Elias hadn't seen a ghost or an alien. He had encountered a being from a higher dimension, a presence not bound by our three-dimensional perception, something that moved through time, space, and consciousness as easily as we walk through a door. What made his case more chilling was the lighthouse itself. Devil's Crown was no ordinary coastal landmark. It was built at the sharp meeting point of oceanic fault lines and ancient indigenous sites. Lighthouses are what mystics call, liminal spaces, structures between land and sea, between isolation and civilization, between here and somewhere else. And well, Elias wasn't the first to witness something strange there. Far north, and years earlier, in April of 1977, 45-year-old park ranger Thomas "Tom" Merrow was deep in the old-growth woods of Frostvale National Preserve, Washington. With nearly 2 decades of forest experience, Tom wasn't easily spooked. That Tuesday afternoon, skies were dim but calm, typical Pacific Northwest weather. He was 3 miles into a remote trail along a creek that threaded its way through towering cathedral-like Douglas firs. The air smelled of moss and pine. As Tom scribbled down notes about a recently fallen tree, something changed. The temperature plummeted, from mild spring coolness to biting winter cold in seconds. He could see his own breath fog the air. His first thought was freak weather, but then he noticed something worse. The creek had stopped flowing. Not frozen, paused, as if time itself had stuttered. The ripples were suspended in place, the water glistened, unmoving like a photograph. Then, something shifted across the creek, a figure, tall, thin, standing in absolute stillness. Tom would later call it the Window Man. The entity looked like it was made entirely of smooth crystal or transparent glass. Around 7 feet tall, its form resembled a stick figure, but within its body swirled galaxies, tiny constellations and cosmic storms that pulsed with light and color. It had no face, just a rounded head with no features. And it didn't walk. It glided, knees bending in unnatural directions, backward, then sideways, then forward, all in one seamless motion. It obeyed no laws of physics that Tom understood. The being stopped, raised a single glassy finger and tapped its chest. Tap. Each tap made the galaxies inside its body flare brighter as though it were trying to say something, like a heartbeat of stars. Tom couldn't look away. His instincts screamed, but his body stayed rooted to the spot, hypnotized. Then, the being tilted its head a perfect 90 degrees as if examining him like a strange artifact. And then, it folded inward, its body compressing thinner and thinner until it vanished into itself like a paper crease. The moment it disappeared, the creek rushed back to life, the wind returned, the cold lifted, reality hit play again. The entire encounter lasted less than 2 minutes. When Tom stumbled back to the ranger station, he looked like he'd seen death. He tried to explain, to a point. But when he mentioned the frozen stream and the strange figure, his supervisor chalked it up to dehydration, maybe a trick of the light. Tom didn't press it, he knew what he saw. And years later, when stories of Devil's Crown Lighthouse began circulating in the underground forums of the strange and unexplained, Tom would finally come forward. Because the galaxies he'd seen inside that being were the same as those Elias Granger had described, down to the very way they pulsed.
Terrified but obsessed, I returned to that same clearing in Frostvale National Preserve dozens of times before retiring in 1983. I never saw the Window Man again, but something about the spot was wrong.
Nothing ever grew where the being had stood. A perfect circle, 3 feet in diameter, remained untouched by moss, grass, or even insects. Like the earth itself had been burned clean at a molecular level. For years, it stayed that way. In 1992, Tom finally told the full story, no edits, no censorship, to a researcher compiling unexplained national park encounters. And this was before online message boards and video uploads made these stories viral. Back then, it wasn't just weird. It was dangerous to share something like this. You risked your reputation, your sanity. You risked your reputation, your sanity. But the more stories surfaced, the more researchers began to see patterns. The encounters weren't isolated. They seemed to cluster around one theme: boundaries. Places where the world folds over itself. Forests, lighthouses, mountains, abandoned places, factories, liminal spaces. And that brings us to Slovenia in 1994. On the night of December 3rd, a 38-year-old factory worker named Marian Novak was working the overnight shift at a crumbling textile mill in eastern Slovenia.
I'd been there nearly 15 years, ever since I was a teenager. Long hours, harsh lighting, old Soviet machinery.
It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. That night, around 2:30 a.m., Marian was alone in the eastern wing of the mill. The building stretched for blocks, dimly lit and half abandoned. Only 2 other workers were clocked in, both on the far end of the compound. He was doing a routine walk when he heard it, a strange clunking sound from one of the older spinning machines. Not totally uncommon, these things broke down all the time. But as he approached, something felt off. The temperature dropped, fast. He could see his breath. Now the heating system should have kept the whole floor warm, but this section felt dead cold. When he got to the machine, he saw a thread had tangled in a gear. Nothing major. He just needed tools. But when he turned to walk back, he stopped. About 20 feet away, near the rusted doorway to the abandoned wing, the air shimmered. At first he thought it was just steam, but it began to take shape. What materialized next shattered Marian's understanding of reality. Floating about 3 feet off the ground was something he could only describe as a geometric impossibility, a constantly shifting cluster of translucent cubes, rearranging themselves in unnatural ways. The shapes folded into and through one another, forming structures that defied the laws of perspective. Looking at it hurt. His eyes wanted to close, but his brain forced them open. The entire thing glowed faintly blue, lighting the dust motes swirling through the air. It moved without sound, until it didn't. The hum began low, deep, felt more in his teeth than in his ears. Then it expanded and contracted at the same time, like it was unfolding toward him while shrinking into the air behind it. Marion tried to back away but realized he couldn't move. His boots were no longer touching the floor, neither were the screws, bolts, and tools scattered on the tables around him. Everything was levitating. He was 6 inches off the ground, suspended in midair along with the metal objects, frozen in a moment that had no place in this world. And the entire time, he wasn't afraid. He was confused, disconnected, like his brain had let go of logic, of time, of everything he thought was real. The cubes pulsed, folded, twisted, and then it stopped. The humming cut out. Every object dropped at once. A thunderclap of falling metal echoed through the mill. Marion hit the ground hard, breathless but unhurt. The shape collapsed inward like a dying star and blinked out of existence. Marion stood in silence. The tools lay scattered, proof that this hadn't been a hallucination. He said nothing for years. Who would believe him? But in 2001, he read an article on unexplainable industrial encounters, and he finally shared his experience with a European researcher. What made the story even more chilling? The textile mill was built directly on the ruins of a 15th century monastery, destroyed by fire in the 1700s. The abandoned section, where the cubes appeared, was constructed exactly where the monastery's chapel had once stood. Again, a liminal space, a boundary zone between history and modernity, sacred and forgotten, seen and unseen. The overlap between dimensions might not be theoretical after all. Darren Mitchell had always been a grounded guy, practical, experienced, no nonsense. But what he encountered one night in October 2003 would haunt him for the rest of his life. At 27 years old, Darren had been working for the MTA for about 4 years. He knew the underground tunnels of the New York City subway system like the back of his hand. On that particular night, he was assigned to conduct an overnight inspection of a stretch of tunnel in Lower Manhattan. The trains were still running, but at that hour they only passed every 30 minutes, giving Darren long stretches of complete solitude in the dim, echoing tunnels. About halfway through his route, Darren arrived at a 3-way junction. One tunnel led back to the station he came from. The second continued on his inspection path. The third, well, that one was different. It was an old maintenance tunnel, part of an abandoned expansion project from the 1970s. Unused. Forgotten. As Darren checked the electrical boxes near the junction, he suddenly felt a temperature drop. Not just a chill, this was immediate bone-deep cold. He could see his breath in front of him, something that made no sense. The tunnels never got that cold, not even in the middle of winter. It wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. The ever-present hum of electricity, the distant rattle of trains, the dripping of water, all gone. Even his own footsteps didn't make a sound, as if the air itself was absorbing everything. That's when he saw movement coming from the mouth of the abandoned tunnel. He snapped his flashlight toward it, and what he saw stopped him cold. It wasn't a person, not really. Darren would later describe it as a puzzle person, a humanoid figure, around 6 feet tall, but with chunks missing like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that hadn't been placed yet. Through the gaps, Darren could see the tunnel wall behind it. Even stranger, the missing pieces weren't fixed, they shifted constantly. Different parts of its body would fade in and out, appearing and disappearing in a continuous fluid motion. The parts that were visible looked solid and transparent at the same time, shimmering faintly with an oily rainbow sheen. The figure had no face, just a smooth, blank surface where its features should have been. And it didn't walk, it glided. With every movement, its limbs flickered, rearranging themselves, the torso twisting, snapping into different shapes. Then came the sound. Darren described it as TV static mixed with speech played in reverse, crackling, unintelligible, and coming from all around him. He was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, unsure if he was even breathing. The creature approached, stopping just 10 feet away. It raised what looked like an arm, though the limb kept shifting shape, branching into multiple tendrils before snapping back into something vaguely human, and pointed at the tunnel wall. Where it pointed, the concrete changed. The wall became transparent, revealing another tunnel behind it. Only this one looked wrong. The architecture didn't match anything Darren had ever seen. The angles were skewed. The lights gave off a purplish hue, and there was writing on the walls, but not in any language he recognized. Then the puzzle person turned its faceless head back toward him and made a subtle motion, an invitation to follow. That was enough. The trance shattered. Darren turned and ran. As he sprinted through the tunnel, sound gradually returned. First his footsteps, then his breathing, then the distant rumble of a train. By the time he made it back to the station, the temperature had returned to normal.
I saw something down there. I don't care how it sounds, but I have to report it.
Darren, you probably just dozed off and had some vivid underground dream.
No, it happened. I'm telling you, it was real. I refuse to go back to that section of the tunnel. Someone else has to take over the shift.
The next day, a different maintenance crew was sent to inspect the area. What they found stunned everyone. At the exact spot where Darren said the puzzle person had pointed, the wall was different. A perfect black circle about 3 feet across had formed in the concrete. It wasn't painted, it wasn't a burn, it was something else entirely. No light reflected off of it, not even flashlights could illuminate its surface. It looked like a portal, an endless hole into nothingness. Experts were brought in. Their conclusion? The concrete had been altered on a molecular level. It wasn't a substance added to the surface, it had become something entirely new. Within a week, the tunnel was sealed off. Officially, they claimed it was structurally unsound. But Darren, and many of his co-workers, knew that wasn't the truth. It was a cover-up. Darren resigned less than a month later. He left New York and moved to Arizona. In his own words, there aren't as many underground spaces there. And if you made it this far into the story, drop the word interdimensional in the comments so I know who the real ones are. If you enjoy strange cases like this, unexplainable encounters, supernatural mysteries, and journeys into the unknown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. We've got plenty more coming your way. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.